Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the webcast, Copay Compliance, Understanding Cost Sharing and Fiduciary Obligations for Employers, sponsored by AIMED Alliance and Alliance for Patient Access. This webcast has been pre-approved for HRCI and SHRM credits. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. You will receive an email from hr.com within 2 business days. It will include the certification credit information. You may also log into your account and view the credits you have received. If you have any questions during the webcast, click on Q&A in your webinar controls and type them in. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Ashira Vantries to get us started.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar on Copay Compliance, Understanding Cost Sharing and Fiduciary Obligations for Employers. My name is Ashira Vantries, and I'm the Director of Legal Strategy and Advocacy at AIMED Alliance. If you're not familiar with AIMED Alliance, we're a nonprofit health policy organization whose mission is to protect and enhance the rights of healthcare consumers and providers. We are staffed by a team of attorneys, and so we try and use our understanding of the law and its requirements to educate stakeholders on how practices can impact healthcare access and may be inconsistent with state and federal laws. I'm pleased to co-host today's webinar with the Alliance for Patient Access. The Alliance for Patient Access, also known as AFPA, is an advocacy organization made up of healthcare providers who prioritize patient-centered care. And with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Josie Cooper, the Executive Director of the Alliance for Patient Access, who will be moderating today's conversation.
Thank you so much, Ashira, and thank you to everybody for taking the time to join the conversation. As Ashira said, I'm Josie Cooper. I lead the Alliance for Patient Access, and we're really pleased to be hosting today's conversation on alternative funding programs. So you'll find here just a very brief agenda for today's conversation. We'll walk briefly through what AFPs are, talk about some of the risks associated with these programs, and then we're very excited to be hosting a panel discussion on the impacts of AFPs. I will note we've got lots of time for Q&A, so please do drop your questions in the Q&A box at any point, and we will get to as many as we can. Next slide. So a little bit about us for those who are less familiar. The Alliance for Patient Access is a nonprofit organization that is very focused on improving healthcare policy, specifically in the areas that you see here on your screen. We work with healthcare providers and partners to support policies that will support the physician-patient relationship and protect clinical decision-making. We focus on limiting insurance tactics, utilization management tactics that increase paperwork burden on patients and providers, and ultimately delay or deny patient access to the treatments their doctors prescribe. And then we really ultimately support, a policy system that will acknowledge every person's individual healthcare needs, rather than try to put people into one kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. Next slide. So ultimately, we are working toward a policy system that supports patient-centered care, that supports, patients and clinicians, that empowers patients, and policies that place the value on getting it right for patients. We believe that's not just best for individual patients, but also for the healthcare system at large. Next slide. So that brings us to the topic of today's conversation, alternative funding programs. We know that as healthcare costs have increased, employers, plan sponsors have very understandably continued to look for strategies to manage medication costs. And one of those strategies has now been, particularly in the last few years, what's known as an alternative funding program, or an AFP, as we'll call it. These programs have really taken off. And they pose a lot of risks to patients, to employees, to employers as well. Next slide. So what exactly is an alternative funding program? Big picture, these are programs that aim to reduce employers' medication costs by shifting the burden of higher cost specialty medications like those used to treat cancer or MS or arthritis, to push the burden of those medication costs away from the employer and onto charitable patient assistance programs. So these programs are typically sold to self-insured health plans by third-party vendors who often are marketing the programs as a way to save money directly to employers. And so we know, again, that prescription medication costs are a huge concern. 51% of pharmacy spending is on specialty medications, while at the same time, we know that really almost all employers are focusing on making sure they can provide affordable quality and health insurance coverage. So, it might sound good, but there are some risks associated with the programs. Next slide. So how does an AFP work? Typically, the third-party vendor, the AFP vendor, works directly with the employer to exclude specialty medications from formularies. So you're an employee, you have employer-sponsored insurance, you've typically had medication coverage through that insurance, but now you still have coverage, you're still an insured patient, but that is sort of an exception, except as it relates, I guess, to your specialty medication, which is then excluded from coverage. So you have insurance, but your specialty medication is excluded from that insurance coverage. So once the medications are excluded, the employee appears to qualify for charitable assistance. So the third-party AFP vendor steers them toward a charitable assistance program, which ultimately may or may not cover the patient's treatment. If a patient cannot access their medication through that charitable assistance, the AFP vendor may then work to import medication from international sources, a practice that puts patients sometimes at risk. And so, next slide. For patients, this doesn't always work. So if you think about this from the employee perspective, once a medication is carved out from coverage, the employee is forced to work with the AFP vendor to help access their treatment. Often the employee must actually sign over their power of attorney so that the AFPA can act on their behalf, a step that many employees are understandably pretty uncomfortable with. The AFP completes the paperwork on the employee's behalf, representing them as eligible for charitable assistance. And the employee, to do that, must often provide personal data, including their household size, their annual income, their disease information. And ultimately, the patient then may or may not access their medication. They may be denied charitable assistance, or there might be not another option. So in practice, employees who are impacted by AFPs don't have a lot of options. If their employer is working with an AFP, patients typically must either use the AFP process or pay out of pocket for their treatment, which many people cannot afford. Next slide. So truly, there are pretty significant impacts on patients. The first is treatment delays. Enrolling in a patient assistance program is time consuming, it is labor intensive, it might take weeks or months. And so even if you are successful and you're able to get charitable assistance, your disease may progress. You may face, quite significant delays that impact your care. Patients may also be impacted by what we kind of call the income gap trap. Charitable assistance programs are intended to serve low income and uninsured patients. That's what's their primary purpose. That's why they were developed. And so many of those programs look at income to determine who qualifies for assistance. So some working folks, may have too high of an income to qualify for charitable assistance, even though they're far from wealthy. So some patients might not actually qualify for the assistance. Patients may also face increased out-of-pocket costs. Charitable assistance is not unlimited, and so patients may ultimately be left on the hook for higher out-of-pocket costs once assistance runs out. So the employer and the insurer are protected against those costs, but the patient, the employee, is not. Last, all of those things contribute to a reduced quality of care. Making necessary medication that is prescribed by a provider, making that harder and slower to access reduces employees' quality of care and may worsen health outcomes. Next slide. More broadly, and our panelists will talk a little bit more about this later, but AFPs also have a negative impact on the healthcare system. First, they deplete resources that are intended for needy patients. Charitable assistance support is intended for those who are lower income, who are uninsured, and by using them for employees who have health insurance coverage, we're really misusing charitable programs and undermining assistance that's intended for needy patients. It also can create new challenges for employers. If employees are sicker because they can't access their medication, they may not be able to be present, to be productive, to be active in their work. If they feel their employer-sponsored insurance isn't working for them, they may look for a new role. And so this type of program is not without risks for employers. And last, they make a very complicated drug pricing and insurance system worse. We have a very complicated system already, and pushing more patients into accessing their medication through alternative methods rather than through their insurance will not help make that better. Next slide. So why are we talking about this in this venue? These programs are continuing to grow. This chart is a little bit dated, but it shows, and this trend seems to be continuing, that alternative funding programs are on the rise with employers. More folks have moved toward considering their use to actually using these programs. And so we think it's really important that folks understand the risks that these might pose for employees as well as for employers. So with that, thank you for your time, and I will turn it to Ashira.
Thanks, Josie. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I'm going to talk about the fiduciary obligations that you have as employers when selecting health benefit plans. And I think this is really important to keep in mind as we're talking about, the concerns that Josie just raised with these alternative funding programs. And I think it's important for employers to remember that while you have to be mindful of costs, that can't come at the expense of employees and the benefits that you're providing. And if it does, that might violate your fiduciary obligation. So I'm going to first provide a big picture overview of what some of these obligations are, and then I'll discuss kind of how some of them may be triggered with alternative funding programs specifically. So let's go to the next slide. So ERISA, you've probably heard of this before. It's known as the Employee Retirement Income and Security Act, and it's a federal law that sets minimum standard for employer-sponsored health plans. Under ERISA, it imposes the fiduciary duty that I'm going to be talking about. And this duty applies to individuals who are making decisions about health plan coverage. So this can be, the plan trustees, the plan administrators, a variety of individuals who have decision-making authority over benefits. Next slide. So under ERISA, fiduciaries have an obligation to act like a prudent fiduciary. So what exactly does that mean? That means you must act like someone with the same care, skill, prudence, and diligence under the circumstances that a similarly situated person would do. So you're taken into account for your knowledge, your understanding of the requirements, and how others in your field are acting in terms of what's reasonable and what's unreasonable. And this is used to judge, how decisions are made and whether you're acting like a prudent fiduciary. So if you're someone who has, let's say, an MBA, you're going to be judged by the same standard as someone else that has an MBA in your role. Next slide. And so in addition to being required to act like a prudent fiduciary, fiduciaries also owe a duty of loyalty to plan beneficiaries. And this requires them to run the plan solely in the interest of participants and beneficiaries and for the exclusive purpose of providing benefits and plan expenses. And as part of this duty of loyalty, plan administrators cannot enter into contracts that have a conflict of interest, so that benefit the plan sponsor more than they benefit the employees. Next slide. And so the Consolidated Appropriations Act, also known as the CAA, indirectly expands a lot of these fiduciary duty requirements and the duty of loyalty because it requires employers to collect additional data from their PBMs and their plan administrators. And so specifically, they're required under this law to report information on prescription drug spending, prescription drug cost, the drugs that are prescribed most frequently, the rebates they're receiving, and the cost sharing that patients are paying and your employees are paying. And it's important to note that I think I've heard, anecdotally that some PBMs will offer to collect this data and submit it appropriately on behalf of employers, but it's ultimately the obligation of employers. So liability for not complying with this law would rest with employers rather than other third parties who may have access to this information. Next slide. And really, one of the benefits of the CAA and how it does expand those fiduciary duty requirements is that it provides greater data to employers, and it ensures that as a prudent fiduciary, they're now given this additional knowledge that's going to be considered in how they're making decisions and whether they're making prudent decisions for the beneficiaries. And it's really intended to give that knowledge that employers may not have previously had to employers for future decision making. Next slide. And so the reason I think acting as such a prudent fiduciary is so important is because there's been some recent litigation that we've seen in this space. And ERISA litigation has historically primarily focused on management of retirement benefits. But these two lawsuits that we're seeing this year, they raise new questions as to how ERISA is going to be used to challenge employers' use and plan benefit design. And so there's two lawsuits. There's Navarro versus Wells Fargo and Lewandowski versus Johnson & Johnson. And what's at the crux of both of these lawsuits is that these employees are alleging that their employers have not managed their prescription drug benefits specifically as a prudent fiduciary because they've done things like negotiate costs with PBMs that are 15 or 200 times higher than how much from where the drug is available elsewhere without insurance. And so it's raising a question as to why a prudent fiduciary would go with these higher costs and work with these PBMs rather than looking at these alternative sourcing for alternative sourcing isn't the right word, these alternative costs for getting these prescription drugs. And they're specifically raising, would any prudent, reasonable person do this? And so it's really challenging the idea, I think, on how employers have, for a long time created their prescription drug benefit plans. And there's two other things in addition to the high cost of prescription drugs and how they're negotiated with PBMs that are raised in this lawsuit. But also in the Navarro lawsuit, they allege that a prudent fiduciary would not pay so much in administrative fees to the PBMs for creating these plan benefit designs and these formularies. And so that's another area employers need to be aware of to make sure they're prudently spending on these third parties who are helping them manage their benefits. And the other thing that was raised in the Lewandowski lawsuit is the steering practices that are used by PBMs to steer employees to higher cost pharmacies. That's just another consideration. And like I said, these lawsuits were really exciting, I would say, in the ERISA space, since we haven't seen ERISA used like this before. It could mean that, in the future, we may see more employers subject to this type of litigation, which is why it's so important now to take steps to ensure you're acting like a prudent fiduciary. Next slide. And so I'm just going to go over 3 ways that we see at Aimed Alliance that AFPs may conflict with employers' fiduciary obligations. I will say I am an attorney, but I'm not your attorney. So if you are concerned about any of these things, please go back to your legal counsel and your legal teams and talk with them about them and make sure you feel comfortable with the decisions that you're making as an employer. Next slide. So the first thing I want to talk about is the access to prescription drugs. As Josie stated, some employees enrolled in these programs experience challenges accessing their prescription drugs, delays, or complete denials in accessing these medications. And one of the important things to know about alternative funding programs is they're often said that when you work with them, they're not going to impact your employees. They're going to have the same coverage. And this is misleading because we know when employees are actually subject to these programs, they do have these adverse benefits. And so one of the things that employers may be risking their complying with their fiduciary duties is because they're supposed to be acting with the sole purpose of providing benefits for the beneficiary. And these programs really focus on ensuring that the plan is saving more on prescription drugs, not ensuring affordable access. And so there can be a challenge there. And there's a really interesting Supreme Court case from several years ago, and it was related to ERISA in retirement, but they had the same fiduciary obligations. And the Supreme Court said in that case, to participate knowingly and significantly in deceiving a plan's beneficiaries in order to save the employer money at the beneficiary's expense is not an act solely in the interest of participants and beneficiaries. So I think that's a great summation of the concerns that are raised with AFPs as to whether these delays and denials in access demonstrate employers aren't acting in the sole interest of beneficiaries, but in the focus of plan cost saving, and that should raise substantial concerns. Next slide. Oh, actually, just go back one slide. One other thing I wanted to say in terms of just general fiduciary obligation concerns is that when working with an alternative funding program, employers have a variety of payment schemes with these programs, but in some cases, the payment schemes can be between 25 to 30% of what the plan would have paid had they not been able to source that drug from the alternative source. And so that can be a really high number and something employers also want to look at to make sure they're not going to run into those same allegations like in the Navarro lawsuit that they're paying unnecessarily high amounts for administrative services. Next slide. So the next type of potential violation that we see at AIMD is violation of HIPAA. So HIPAA is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and this is primarily known as a data protection law, but it also has anti-discrimination provisions within it that apply to employer-sponsored health plans. And so specifically what it prohibits is it prohibits creating a plan design that discriminates based on a health factor. So we see that there's an argument here that because alternative funding programs target specialty medications, they're essentially targeting patients with chronic conditions and requiring them to go through a separate process compared to those who don't have chronic conditions and don't need access to these medications. And so one of the questions that was raised when individuals registered for this webinar was how employers can provide different benefits to different employees. And so employers do have some discretion to provide different benefits to employees, but those different benefits have to be based on some type of employment status. So whether they're full-time or part-time or their geographic location, it can't be on things like a health factor. And a health factor is someone's disability, their chronic condition, or their claims data. All of those things may be considered discriminatory if they're used to create different sets of benefits. And I think as this relates to the fiduciary duties, it raises the question of, can you confidently say you're acting as a prudent fiduciary when you're acting in a discriminatory manner? Next slide. And then the last one that I want to highlight is the use of international importation. So as Josie mentioned, some of these programs, if those charitable assistance programs aren't available, they'll require employees to import their medications from outside the United States. And so this is likely from our perspective at AIMD Alliance inconsistent with federal law. So under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, it's illegal to import drugs from outside the United States, and that's just kind of the flat rate general prohibition. However, the FDA has recognized a personal importation policy, which says that the FDA is not going to use its enforcement authority over individuals who, like me, go to Canada to get medication if it's for a non-serious condition. But this policy is intended to ensure, that the average person like me, Ashira, if I want to go to Canada to get my prescription drugs, I'm not going to be penalized because that's not the type of importation they're worried about. The type of importation that they're worried about is this widespread importation. And so while there is that exemption policy, mandating employees get their drugs from outside the United States doesn't fit within that policy because it forces the choice on employees rather than having that individual make that decision themselves. Next slide. And so one of the things that I want to raise here is that the FDA has actually sent warning letters to certain third-party companies that are working with employers to import their medications from outside the United States. And they've said this violates the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and you're required to stop this conduct immediately. So there is some action by FDA in this space that I think should raise additional alarm bells for employers. Next slide. And so the last thing I wanted to highlight is also that AIMD Alliance sent a letter to the FDA early this year requesting that they provide additional guidance on how employers were using these programs and whether it was consistent with federal law. And there was a limited time period in which FDA had to respond. And at that time period, the FDA said they couldn't come to a decision because it was a complex issue that needed more analysis. And I wanted to flag that because we hear often that employers are presented with these programs and told it's completely consistent with federal law to import medications from overseas and require your employees import medications from overseas. But I think this letter and the warning letter sent by FDA demonstrate it's not as clear cut. And so employers need to talk with their legal counsel to understand the risks of working with these programs, as well as the risks to their employees. And again, I think it's a difficult position to be in to say that you are requiring your employees to violate federal law and that you are still acting like a prudent fiduciary. So I think that can also be another challenge that really needs to be assessed and the risks weighed with adopting one of these programs. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Josie to lead us to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Ashira. I think that's an incredible overview of some of the risks here. And we're thrilled to be able to talk more about these programs and what folks are seeing through our panel discussion. So just to briefly introduce today's panelists, we're joined first by Rachel Klein, Deputy Executive Director of the AIDS Institute. Rachel joined the AIDS Institute, a leading national nonprofit organization, in 2018, where she leads the Institute's federal policy work, coordinates advocacy efforts to advance policies that increase access to healthcare and treatment. And Rachel, thank you so much for taking the time to join. We are also joined by Mike Stansel, the President and CEO of the Pittsburgh Business Group on Health. The Pittsburgh Business Group on Health is a nonprofit coalition of employers working together to improve healthcare for their employees in the community. And of course, we will also hear from Ashira. So thank you all for taking the time to join and share your perspectives. Mike, I want to turn to you first for a question. We've already talked about how employers are concerned about the cost of prescription medications. Is this something that you're seeing among your employers as well? And how are employers trying to mitigate those costs?
Yes, they're very concerned. I think the concern over especially the cost of specialty drugs. You mentioned earlier that, right, the specialty drugs accounts for 51% of total pharmacy spending, and that also only represents 2% of their population that uses them, right? There's this massive imbalance. And we know that there are new cell and gene therapies that are in the pipeline that are going to be hitting the market that have incredible benefits, but come with these just astronomical price tags, right? And no employer or plan sponsor wants to be in a position where they can't afford to pay for a potentially life-saving or life-altering therapy or treatment. But at the same time, they have to be very mindful of their of how they pay for that. So these alternative funding programs seem to be, right, they emerged on the market as kind of an easy button, right? Oh, we'll help you mitigate these costs. Happily, it hasn't been the focus of our coalition and the coalition movement writ large. So as we sort of saw going, I think it was like between 2021 and 2023, a jump from about 7% AFP utilization up to about 13% in 2023. So we were seeing an increase, but it was still, a little bit on the lower side. We started to encourage other cost saving metrics and ways in which we can sort of influence our employers to take safer routes. We're looking for those opportunities to fix some of the problems with the industry that persist at the same time as creating better cost savings opportunities for them. So a lot of that comes in with the new transparent PBMs, pass-through PBMs that have simplistic fee structures. They don't do spread, they don't retain rebates, and they use those sort of overall cost controls to help sort of mitigate that issue. But outside of that, we're looking at really like a full exploration of ways to control the cost, payment plans, HSAs, various things that we can kind of put in place to help plan and strategize for that. But honestly, right now, there is no panacea. There is no single method that's going to help employers navigate these extreme costs. And then I'll tell you, the big thing that we've been pushing, and as we're seeing these lawsuits progress, these are dangerous precedents for employers, for plan sponsors as fiduciaries, because the typical people that we're engaging with, if your PBM is one of the big three, right? They are fighting tooth and nail to kind of keep things the way they are. We saw as they testified before the House Oversight Committee that they believe that the contracting, right, what happens at the contract level is where all these details need to be. covered. And so in that, it stays on the employer. It stays on the plan sponsor as somebody who, as where the responsibility lies. So that means they really don't want any skin in the game, and they're not really going to hold their own feet to the fire to make sure that you're not paying too much. And just as sort of like a nice little example of this, and this was Greg Baker, who is the CEO of Affirmed RX, which is one of these transparent PBMs, was testifying in that same testimony, brought up, and I'm not a pharmacist, so I'm going to mispronounce this name, so I apologize, but they brought up the cancer drug imatinib, right, which it's a generic for Gleevec. And at Cubans, we like to point at Mark Cuban's cost plus drugs because it's just a great benchmark for pricing. The annual cost on Cubans cost plus drugs for that cancer medication is $866.40 for a year plan. The Tennessee state plan through CVS, that same drug for an annual price is $212,522, right? And this is the same company that's saying, well, it's up to you in your contract to make sure that all this stuff is good. It's up to you to review all these prices that you're paying to make sure that that's good. And if we do something like that and have that massive price variability, that's not on us, right? And legally, they're right. It's not on them. It's on the plan sponsor. It's on the plan fiduciary. So those are sort of the things that I think are keeping a lot of our employers up at night, and that they're trying to figure out and resolve.
Thanks, Mike. I think that's extremely enlightening. And I like what you said about kind of the PBM interplay here, because this is, it's interesting how the AFPs sort of interact with the PBMs. And so we'll talk more about that later. But Rachel, a question to you, on the other side of this conversation about AFPs are the employees and their families. So, I asked Mike, about kind of the concerns about prescription drug costs from the employer perspective, but can you talk about that a little bit from the employee perspective? What would you say to employers who feel like they need to steer patients to lower cost medications?
Yeah, thanks, Josie. I mean, look, we're all concerned about the cost of healthcare, right? Healthcare is really expensive, but that's why people have health insurance, because they know that that's the only way that they're going to be able to afford to get the care that they need, including prescription drugs. The vast majority of people get their insurance as an employee benefit. And that means that how that benefit is structured has enormous implications for how people are able to engage with the healthcare system and whether or not they're able to afford to get the care that they need. So I think it's important to remember too that when we're talking about the very expensive drugs, specialty medications, those are generally medications that are used to treat very serious and very complex chronic illness. So for employees or those employees' family members who are navigating this really complicated healthcare system with a really complicated healthcare illness, it can be really, really challenging to figure out what is the right care. There's already a lot of gatekeeping that goes on for these really high cost medications. They all have utilization management. You have to go through step therapy, you have to go through prior authorization, and you have to be working closely with your providers to figure out what is the right medications for you to try or for your family members to try, and sort of get to the place where you finally have a prescription for one of these high cost specialty medications. So there's really a lot that's sort of already built into the system that tries to steer people not just to the most cost-effective medication, but to the most effective medication. And so then when you are adding these alternative funding programs on top of all of that complication, it really does have some serious implications for patients. And I guess I just sort of want to reiterate that other point that while all of us are concerned about cost effectiveness and finding the lowest cost medication, I will include employees in that group because people don't want to pay more. Oftentimes, the out-of-pocket cost sharing in employer health plans is structured as a co-insurance benefit. So you have to navigate your deductible, which is an amount that you're paying before your health insurance kicks in, plus potentially a percentage of the list price of the drug. So, as costs are going up, patients are very concerned about these costs, and are really, bearing a greater and greater portion of those costs over time as insurance structures have changed. So that is a really significant impact already for people. So I would say that sort of those cost concerns are already baked in. What patients are looking for is the most effective medication, because keeping those conditions treated is what enables people if to be productive in the workforce, right? Either I'm trying to keep myself healthy so that I can continue to work, to be productive and successful in my workplace, to support my family and engage in all of those activities that I need to engage in, or I'm trying to keep my family member healthy. And that's really important too, because, a lot of people, myself included, are in a position where we have a child who has a serious chronic illness. And when my child is sick and can't get the medication that they need, that's all I can think about, right? Is I've got to make sure to keep my child healthy. So I think, all of these are factors that are going into what employees are already thinking about, and have a really, really important impact on their ability to be present at work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Rachel. I think that's extremely clear picture of things. And one thing that I want to ask a little bit more about, you talked about sort of the need for consistent coverage. Patients with chronic diseases rely on consistent coverage and consistent access. Can you talk more about how AFPs then sort of interfere with what employees expect in terms of their coverage?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we already have talked a little bit about how this system is already pretty complicated, right? I think we've all had the experience of going to a pharmacy to get a prescription filled and having some issue with that prescription. Either the cost sharing is higher than you expected it to be, or it's not in stock, or it's not covered by the insurer. And then you have to navigate the system that already is involving your provider, the insurer, and the pharmacy. And it takes a lot of time and effort to navigate those systems, right? It's not super easy to like pick up the phone and call your doctor and get a hold of somebody and ask if you can get a different prescription, or to pick up the phone and call your insurer and find out why there's some issue with the coverage. So now we're adding another player into this already really complicated mix, which we are hearing from patients all the time is adding more complications to an already complicated system. It's creating delays in their ability to access medications. And when you are going without care for a chronic illness, that can have really substantial impacts on your health. Sometimes, health conditions can deteriorate while you're waiting for a medication to be filled. Sometimes that can be, overcome when you finally get that fill. But for some of the conditions we're talking about, when there's a deterioration in your care and a deterioration in your condition, that's permanent. So you're now sort of starting with a setback that you're going to require even more healthcare. And I guess that's the other thing I want to sort of mention is a lot of these medications are keeping people at a place where they're healthy. But when they don't have access to their medication consistently, you're not just saving money on the prescription drug side, you're actually increasing other healthcare costs. If people need to go see the doctor more often, or get labs and tests, or be hospitalized, all of those can increase costs in other parts of the healthcare ledger. So it's kind of a balance that needs to be struck, right? We have consistent access to high cost medication. Yes, that's expensive, but pulling back on that access just because of cost doesn't take into consideration all of the other costs that may be built into the system and the impact on people's health.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Mike, when you heard about these programs for the first time, were you surprised about employers adopting these given their obligations? How concerning do you think it is that these programs are often pitched to employers as being sort of no harm solutions? What's, I guess, your take on that?
Yeah, so it wasn't a surprise. We know that the people that are making these decisions, right? The HR professionals that are sitting at the table and making these decisions, this is not their sole concern, right? They have so much work on their plates that they have to do and they have to track, and they're expected to be experts in every aspect of healthcare all the time. So of course there's this natural inclination to trust your partners and the people that you're working with. And that works when the system's working. But of course, right, with this increased fiduciary responsibility, that trust has to be really, really deep. And so when you have some people that show up, the first word that comes to my mind is snake oil salesman, but that might be a little heavy-handed. But people that show up and they say, "Look, I've got this quick, easy button. This thing, we can use this AFP or this AFP to help offset these costs." They're not considering the additional complications. They're not considering that for every difficulty that's now introduced at the patient level, at the employee level, they now have to explain that as a fiduciary. You have to be able to document and understand why these things are being introduced. And if it starts to have a negative impact, then that's more risk. If there are data that is being generated from these transactions that they're not getting because maybe their AFP partner has it written into their contract that type of data or information is proprietary, they now have to try to battle and get that, because if they don't have that, if they don't report that, if they don't include that as part of their total reporting, they're the ones that are held accountable. So it's not a surprise. It's kind of the Wild West out there, just like the employee is constantly dealing with their physician, trying to get prior auth, trying to sort out what's covered, what's not. And there's all these different pieces to the puzzle. As an HR professional, you've got your broker, you've got your PBM, you've got clinical oversight, you've got all these different people that are trying to tell you and explain to you what's the best path forward and how to save money. And the biggest problem is that all of those people profit off of what they're telling you, right? And I think that's probably one of the bigger concerns, that I see in the AFP, like third-party AFPs, is they're motivated by getting transaction approved, right? Getting matches. That's where they get money. It's not about results, right? It's not about making sure that the person's getting what they need. It's, yeah, we can push these through and we can get these things done. And there's so much risk there. There's so much risk that it just, to me, it seems not worth it. But I understand if you're under a crunch, you've got a lot going on. Somebody tells you they got an easy solution for you to cover that medicine. Yeah, I get it.
Thanks, Mike. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I like how you called it an easy button earlier, because it does seem like an easy fix, and that's why we host things like today, because we think it's really important that folks hear the other side of it too. Rachel, I know we've sort of touched on this, but I think it's worth being explicit, I guess. If employees do not have coverage and those needs met, what does that generally mean for performance in the workplace?
Yeah, I think there's sort of multiple prongs to this question, right? Like, first of all, obviously people need access to care. They're relying on their insurance as the gateway to get access to that care. These are conditions that we're talking about here, where if people don't have the care that they need in a consistent and ongoing way, those conditions are going to get worse, and that's going to affect their ability to show up in the workplace. It's going to affect their ability to function as a human being. And that's true whether it's the employee or whether it's their child or their partner, whoever is covered by that insurance. And insurance is a benefit, right, for employees. It's a reflection of the value that you bring as an employee to your workplace. So I think, another point to mention here is that when that health insurance isn't actually covering the health care that you need, that's a reflection of the value that your employer holds for your work. So I think it really undermines not only people's actual health, but also their loyalty and their resilience in the workplace too, because they're feeling like maybe their work isn't as valued as it should be. So, what we have experienced is that, people are more likely to look, this is not optional healthcare. This is necessary healthcare. So if your insurance isn't providing the access that you need to find an alternative insurer, because the alternative is not being able to bear those costs yourself. The alternative is not getting the care that you need or that your family needs. So, there is some research that has recently been released that shows that all of the anecdotal evidence we've all been collecting is quantitatively real as well. People who are in these AFP programs, who are experiencing delays, who are not able to get the care that they need, who have extra hurdles to surmount in order to get the care that they need, are more likely to consider leaving their jobs or to actually leave their jobs 3 to 5 times as likely. People are reporting a lot of increased stress, right, which is not reflecting well on their ability to work, their ability to take care of themselves and their families. And so these programs have real impacts on people. And I think that at the end of the day, the takeaway is people with serious and chronic illnesses, or who have family members who need serious and chronic illnesses, need to get access to the treatment that they need. And they're going to do what it takes in order to get that, or they're going to suffer some serious setbacks.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that. I think that's important to think about, because employee retention is something you hear a lot about, and we all know the importance there. Mike, so we've talked a lot about, AFP's probably not the best solution to save money, but can we talk a little bit more about the alternatives? What are you guys looking at as, alternative cost saving solutions for employers?
Yeah, so I think the simple sort of high level takeaway that I'd want to impart is you want subtractive solutions, not additive solutions, right? So if somebody's coming to you and saying, pay for this extra service and we'll solve your problems, I feel like that's an indication that you're going to start overcomplicating things. So what we're really looking at is solutions that simplify the problem to begin with. When we're talking about cell and gene therapies, right? Specifically, as a specific case. And some of these solutions do have to kind of be medication specific or treatment style specific. Going directly to the manufacturers. A lot of them for cell and gene therapies have installment plans. They have arrangements that are outcomes based for payments. They even have some sort of like tiered payment strategies. They call sort of like a Netflix model that bakes in these sort of additional costs into that space. And then, I would also say, and I think this one works for that, but it also works for larger costs as a whole. And this is a bit of a self plug, but I'm pretty sure not everybody here is in Pittsburgh. employer coalitions, and they're all across the country, and we work together with the National Alliance of Healthcare Purchaser Coalitions, and we actually have some great action briefs on both of these issues that I'd be more than happy to share. But working with these coalitions uses that collective purchasing power, and can oftentimes get these industry players to kind of bend to our need. I'd also say that, taking a look at some of these new transparent PBMs and companies that are using that they're simplifying their approach to drug pricing, can help sort of control some of those costs. And it's also allowing us to use market forces to address some of the bloat in other areas. So while we're looking at these, specialty drugs and these really large costs that are maybe right, we're trying to take care of that 51% cost for the 2% of the population. It gives us that power to kind of negotiate and force things in the direction that we want to go. I'm wary of new market solutions that are add-on, that are trying to come in and fix things. I'll say it's huge to get your lawyers involved. Take a look at your contracts. You absolutely have to. I mean, I'm going to take the big three PBMs at their word and say it's up to you in your contract. If you're renewing and you're with one of them, go through it line by line with somebody who understands the fiduciary requirements of ERISA and the expansion under the CAA in 2021, and make sure that you're reporting and everything's there, and make sure that you're putting favorable, transparent data pieces, or parts of the contract around your data and around all the payments and everything that's in there, to make sure that you're covering yourself as best as possible. I feel like anything sort of bolt on or add on to that is just increasing the complication, is going to give you more heartburn than is going to give you solutions.
Thanks so much, Mike. And from the employee perspective, Rachel, as all employers are looking at alternatives, what should they watch out for?
Well, I think, look, these are problems that are big, right? And complex. But the solutions that shift costs to employees are not going to benefit your employees at the end of the day, right? If I have to pay more in cost sharing, or if I have services that I'm not able to get because they're not covered in my plan, or if I have more hurdles that I have to jump through, over, around to navigate this really big, complex, expensive system, at the end of the day, that's not going to benefit me. So, making sure that you have a plan that is comprehensive, that, as Mike said, is not adding extra hurdles and extra complications, or expanding the holes in the plan, is really, really important for employees.
Thanks, Rachel. And Ashira, what are the regulatory considerations that employers should be thinking about?
Yeah, so I think the fiduciary duty obligations are really important for them to think about. As we see a new administration, we could see additional regulations expanding that, imposing new requirements for reporting. And so I think, like Mike said, really getting your legal counsel involved and having them go through these contracts with you, if that's where there's the most negotiation power for employers at the moment, making sure that you're getting the bang for your buck, right? Making sure that there are favorable provisions in you, that you're aware of how your dollars are being spent, and why they're being spent in certain areas.
Thanks so much, Ashira. And thank you all for this excellent conversation. I know we have a couple of minutes left. And so if folks have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I see a couple already. Mike, this is maybe for you. How do I recognize an AFP if they come? What's the telltale sign?
I mean, I think that that's what they're going to lead with, that, right? I mean, they're going to lead with the fact that they're looking at connecting your employees with alternative payment strategies that are not going to hit your your claims ledger, right? They're going to be looking for ways to find other sources there. I think realistically, anybody that comes to you completely focused on specialty spend, and they start talking about ways that you can massage your sort of existing program, is going to be a little bit suspect, right? I think it needs to be end to end, like an end-to-end approach. I mean, you really want to look at something that's, completely at the total PBM level, or somebody that specializes from a legal perspective, into doing this type of work, or is just making recommendations based on the data. When you start getting into tapping into, charitable funds to sort of offset your costs, I think that you're sort of stepping outside of really solving the problem long term and just looking for a quick solution.
Thanks, Mike. And I think there are about 20 of these companies. And so you can find some of the names online as well. I won't walk through them all, but
I don't want to get sued by saying
Mike, yes, yes. So there's a question that came into the chat, actually. I might send this your way, Ashira. Is AFP adoption among employers concentrated in a certain size? Are they more popular in large companies, small companies?
Yeah, so I think it really varies. I will say that we primarily see these programs in self-funded plans. We're not seeing them in any fully insured plans, but the types of self-funded plans that are adopting them can really vary from anyone with as small as 200 employees to as many as over 5,000. We see a trend in really small public employees like school districts adopting these programs and other smaller employers. But it really kind of varies on the needs of the employer and their interest in these programs, but primarily in self-funded plans.
Thanks so much, Ashira. I think we've largely answered the questions I see in the chat. But with our last couple minutes, any final thoughts from our panelists? Any big takeaways you want to leave folks with? Mike, I might let you go first.
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing is, right, we have to rely on our partners. There's too much being asked of these teams to actually do individually. And I think the biggest thing is making sure that you're partnering with people that you trust and that are in some way putting their business on the line, that are demonstrating in some way that their interests are aligned with yours. There's a lot of different ways to do that. There's a growing trend, and I love it. I think every organization should be in the healthcare space of these companies that are being founded or rebranding as public benefit companies, right? Where they're putting client success, healthcare, health outcomes as the number one thing they're being held accountable to, and then profit second, right? That switch is incredibly important. And we all have brokers and consultants, or many of us do. I know some people that don't. And there's a broad range end to end. Some are fantastic, some are not so great. And you really need to kind of get a read on where yours is. And I think a lot of these recommendations, whether or not they're making them or they're withholding them, what they're willing to put on the line are good indications of where you stand in that continuum. But definitely seek out those people that you can really develop trust and that are willing to put things on the line.
I love that, Mike. Rachel, anything you'd add?
Yeah, I think I would just encourage employers to really be thinking about their employees as partners in this effort, right? Is that, I think I've said it too many times already. These are really complicated issues, but they're really important issues, right? This is the basic fundamental thing that families will sacrifice in order to be able to get healthcare that they need. And it really is the basis. Health insurance in a lot of ways is not just a benefit, it's a work support, right? It's the thing that enables your employees who have healthcare needs to participate. And so to think of your employees more as your partners in this effort and to be providing services that help them navigate the system in a smart way to support them in their healthcare journeys is, I think, really, really important. And it's sort of a switch in the way that a lot of these issues are approached, right? Like we often hear about how people need more skin in the game. People living with chronic illness have their whole lives in the game, right? And so the more that employers can be there to help them navigate this system, I think the more productive and effective their relationship is going to be with their employees.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Rachel. And Ashira?
Yeah, I'll be quick. I think, under the fiduciary duty, there is the obligation to continually audit your plan to make sure, you're getting the best deal with your PBM partner. But also, I think what Rachel said is so important. Auditing with your employees, understand how they're using the benefits, understand if the programs that are being pitched to them are actually acting as promised. And that can not only help you ensure that you're meeting the needs of your employees, but you're also meeting your legal obligations.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I know we're coming up on time, so just want to say a huge thank you to all of you, Mike, Rachel, Ashira, for taking the time to share your perspectives on these programs. Thank you all for attending, and I will turn it back to the HR.com team.
Thank you. This concludes our webcast today. I would like to thank our presenters, as well as all of you for joining us. If you would like to view this webcast again, the recording and slides will be available on hr.com on our archived webcast page. If you're looking for your credits, those will arrive within 2 business days, and we also send out an email with the credit information. Just a reminder to the audience to fill out a quick feedback survey that will open on a new tab on your screen. It only takes a few minutes, and your valuable input is key to improving the quality of our webcasts. Thank you all for joining us today, and have a good rest of the day.